We're at the bottom of page 75. We're going to look at baptism. Now, if you look at the big idea baptism will become an issue much later, and it will remain a problem until the Philadelphian age. It'll still be a problem then too, but it'll be greatly relieved by the Philadelphian age. And Philadelphian age is the sixth age of church. So it's not as prominent here, but you're going to find that in church history, baptism and communion are really a function of the Roman pagan system. Okay, that's whatever errors they had was because of the adherence to forms that you would have found in Roman paganism, and that we had seen earlier when we looked at the effect of Roman religion. It was like you saw all the things that you see in a typical Catholic church, all the formalities were there in the Roman pagan religion. And so that's going to be the influence from that. You would think that communion is maybe something that they were going to pick up elements from the Old Testament. No, the errors that they picked up on were from the formalism of pagan religion. So let's look at baptism. So baptism was specifically practiced as immersion for believers in the New Testament. The scriptures will be twisted and theological innovations will be introduced. And looking up at our screen, we see the Council of Carthage in 252. That is when baptism will come into question. It'll come into question at that time. That infant baptism was not known in this Ephesian church age is reflected that in the next age, there was no change in the qualifications for baptism that only someone of age could fulfill. The prominent writers of the second century saw repentance, faith, and instruction as necessary before baptism. It would not be until 252 AD that the question would be asked at all. And you'll find that when we get to page 110 in the book. Okay, so any questions about that before we move to the next piece of section? There shouldn't be any questions. Any comments, any questions? Okay. Okay, so yeah, baptism of believers only. Let's see, and we'll look at the arguments for why people, had infant baptism later on when they did get it. Communion. Okay, the other ordinance, the big idea. Communion will become an issue later also and prove to be divisive even among the reformers. The reformers who will be objecting to the Mass, they'll have various views that they're going to try to use to still retain certain notions about communion. They'll want to the reformers are going to retain some of the mystical aspects of communion from the Catholic Church, some of the unifying factors among the idea of a universal church, and so they'll have that. It's not like they're going to even get that correct then. So paragraph 191. Communion will become a point of contention very quickly, though, in church history. For all the notions that will divide even relatively compatible church movements, there is actually little said about communion in the Bible. People will make a big deal about the efficacy of communion, but you really don't see that in the Bible. Communion is very much symbolic and not a real big thing. Even though it's related to the Passover sacrifice, it does not correlate directly to it, since in the Passover, no blood is actually drunk, and the flesh of the sacrifice is eaten as well as bread. So if somebody wants to call communion some idea of sacrifice dealing with sin, okay, and if they wanted to try to correlate that to the Passover, they would fall short. The Passover just talks about Christ's blood being sacrificed, not that we keep on having blood that we keep in the Passover. They didn't have blood at all involved. Okay. Paragraph 192. Jesus downplayed the significance of the bread and wine in the bread of life discourse in John chapter 6. And this is one of the major things that we want to see about this in the scriptures, that this is one of those base doctrines. It forms the basis forming doctrines for what is going to be the pattern that we need in reality after this. So we're getting a baseline established here, what communion really was in the Bible. The Jews had asked for bread as Moses had provided manna in the wilderness. Jesus turned this around to speak of his flesh and blood, even though there was no wine mentioned by the Jews. They were only looking at manna, and Jesus takes it a step further. In context, Jesus was talking about manna, not the Passover, which would have been relative at all to his mention of flesh and blood. He's responding to the issue of manna, not trying to make this a Passover thing. To show that he was not talking about communion directly, he returned back to the issue of the manna, which is what they were asking about. So let's look at it in John 6, 58 to 63. He says, "This is that bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers did eat manna and are dead. He that eateth of this bread shall live forever." These things said he in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum. Many therefore of his disciples, when they had heard this, said, "This is an hard saying, who can hear it?" When Jesus knew in himself that his disciples murmured at it, he said unto them, "Doth this offend you? What and if ye shall see the Son of Man ascend up where he was before? It is the Spirit that quickeneth, the flesh profiteth nothing. The words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life." He says, "Doth this offend you?" And really, this whole idea of the Mass, what I refer to as the blasphemy of the Mass. Okay, that's how I call it, the blasphemy of the Mass. It is blasphemous. It is such a hard thing, and really this gets some strong feelings. If you talk to people in Orthodox churches, they have the same take on it because they were unified with the Roman Church long enough to be able to establish the idea of transubstantiation creeping into the communion, and so they will take great issue with this. I'll talk to Coptic members, and they'll like us an awful lot because they see that we're serious about religion, and as they've had to be serious in Egypt, and they like that seriousness, and then they start finding out some of these things that you believe, and it typically be about Mary, but very early on will be the idea of the Mass, and they really want to retain that idea. And so that becomes a dividing point for them. So when Jesus says it's a hard saying, yeah, it has been forever. Yes, you want to?
I just picked up on something you said. I have a lot of them that reside on my property. I guess I've never had that point of the conversation. Do they believe in Mass Coptic?
Yeah,
They
they
say
believe in
Coptic Christian.
transubstantiation. Yes, yes, yeah, very, very much like Catholic. Miss Nancy.
Yeah, they any Egyptian Coptic that I've ever talked to, including the fellow across the street,
Yeah.
They are very thoroughly indoctrinated about this transubstantiation. They're just like Catholics. And when I've shown them this verse where Jesus says, "The words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life." I said, he's not saying, "Here, take a piece of my arm." And they are very insistent. No, it's literal. And then they go down to verse, I think it's 66, where it says, "Oh, and from that time on, many of his disciples didn't," because this is just such a hard thing for people to accept. And they feel very self-righteous that they're the ones who do believe the words of Christ. So he said that, this is in fact his body and blood. And I said, well, then how do you account for the scriptures all throughout the Old Testament that expressly forbid the drinking of blood?
Right.
And he just looked at me and said, "I have to ask my priest that
Yeah.
one."
Yeah, yeah,
So they really haven't thought this through, and they're ignoring the words of Christ where he says, this is, you know, this is spirit. These words are spirit.
yeah, yeah, Brother Joe, yeah.
I was just gonna say also at the Last Supper, he didn't give them his physical body and blood. If there was ever gonna
Yeah.
be a time, it would have been then.
Yeah,
And he just actually literally gave them bread and wine.
yeah. Yeah, in fact, when I have taken the time in the past to look up articles and, people arguing for Catholicism and the Mass, they will very often look at John chapter 6. They'll quote all kinds of things. They stop before they get to verse 63. They stop short. They do not go to that verse. I don't know. They're doing it deliberately. They just yeah, really. Yeah, it's the spirit that quickeneth, the spirit that makes alive. Okay, to be quick means to be alive. And so the flesh profiteth nothing. It's doing nothing. And then, but he then specifies exactly what he means by the spirit, and he points out the spirit is the words that he speaks of, they are spirit and they are life. Okay, paragraph 193. Nevertheless, he diminished the role of bread and wine when the disciples indicated that what he said was hard to understand. He pointed out that there was nothing of inherent spiritual benefit, since the flesh was nothing, only the spirit, and that it was his words that were spiritual and life-giving. This is entirely in keeping with the idea of Jesus as the Logos, the Word who gives life. In Luke 22, Jesus identified that the Passover bread and wine was to be done in remembrance of him, much as the Passover was done in remembrance of the Jews' exodus from Egypt. Luke 22, verse 19, and he took bread and gave thanks and brake it and gave unto them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. This do in remembrance of me. Likewise also the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the New Testament in my blood, which is shed for you. Paul repeated this remembrance, emphasizing that this was a way to, quote unquote, show the Lord's death. The word there for show means declare, preach, teach, and it's related to the word for evangelize. 1 Corinthians 11:23 then says, for I have received of the Lord that which I also delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. When he had given thanks, he brake it and said, take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. After the same manner, he took the cup when he had supped, saying, this cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do as oft as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you do show the Lord's death till he come. Just like we tell the kids, baptism is a way to show a spiritual truth, so also communion is a way to show a spiritual truth. Hebrews, which relates Jesus as the fulfillment and is better than anything in the law with its sacrifices and priesthood, mentions nothing about communion or its efficacy. You would think that if there was a place where you're going to get communion referred to or something taught about it as something that would come down from Passover, you'd think Hebrews would have it. No, Paul doesn't refer to communion at all. In fact, Hebrews refers only to the sufficiency of the one sacrifice that Jesus made of himself. The sacrifice of Christ provides eternal redemption after it was offered in heaven. Hebrews 9, verse 11, but Christ being come and high priest of good things to come, by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building, neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. For if the blood of bulls and of goats and the ashes of an heifer sprinkling the unclean sanctifieth to the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. And then if you jump down to verse 19, for when Moses had spoken every precept to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and of goats and with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the testament which God hath enjoined unto you. Moreover, he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry. And almost all things are by the law purged with blood, and without shedding of blood is no remission. And that is a real key one there. In fact, this is one of the things that that Nancy had keyed in on when she was getting saved, and she was looking at Hebrews chapter 9. And I was always impressed with that. What what teenager is hep to anything in the book of Hebrews at all, but reading it picked up on this as a thing with Catholicism, because she was always taught, of course, that that the mass was supposed to be an unbloody sacrifice. Whoop, nope. According to this here, you got to have blood. It's either bloody or unbloody. Well, it's unbloody, and if it's sacrifice, that presents another problem. It was therefore necessary that the patterns of things in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has not entered into the holy places made with hands, which are the figures of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. And then you go down to verse number 26, where it says, Christ's sacrifice was a one-time event, not to be repeated, which de-emphasizes the efficacy of any remembrance of his sacrifice. The remembrance does not have efficacy, it does not have power to cleanse. In other words, no power of salvation. It's just a remembrance. Verse 26, for then must he often have suffered since the foundation of the world, but now once in the end of the world hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment, so Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many, and unto them that look for him shall he appear the second time without sin unto salvation. So we are looking forward to this. Now, the salvation here is not our being born again. It's talking about the completed deal, the resurrection. So it's done one time, and then this is reiterated in Hebrews chapter 10. Again, where do you see any communion being mentioned here? Only the sacrifice of Christ is what had significance. So verse 10 and 14, Hebrews 10:10. By the which will we are sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And every priest standeth daily ministering and offering oftentimes the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But this man, after he offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down on the right hand of God, from thence henceforth expecting till his enemies be made his footstool. For by one offering he has perfected forever them that are sanctified. Apart from the high priestly office of Christ, after the order of Melchizedek to justify offering himself as a sacrifice for our sin, there was no office of the priesthood indicated in the New Testament church. I said that before. We were talking about that when we were talking about offices of the church. This is it for any sense of priesthood. No priesthood in the New Testament church. Where is this going to come from? As I said, on the other occasion, it is not going to come from people trying to emulate the Old Testament temple and its worship. It's going to come from the idea of a priesthood is going to come from Roman paganism, where they look to have a form of communion that is like the Mass. That's where it's going to come from, not from the Old Testament. There was a complete absence of any sense of communion as a means of sanctifying grace in the whole of the New Testament. You look through the whole New Testament, you will never see anything that indicates communion having sanctifying or salvation effect with grace. Stop and think about it. 1 Corinthians. Can you think about anything from 1 Corinthians? You have a bunch of problems that Paul addresses and a bunch of looking for wisdom from God. And then you get over to chapter 11. You see some stuff about communion, but it only has reference to being done in memory. 2 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul deals with them correcting a problem. You'd think that in the sense of correcting a problem, this if communion has some effect in correcting a problem, that would have certainly been mentioned there. Okay, and make sure you take communion to get your souls cleansed. No, it just talks about confession over in 2 Corinthians. Galatians, all about works and salvation by faith only, which goes directly against any sense that some form, some religious form would have power. Doing some work like having communion would have some effect. No, it's absent. It's not there. Thessalonians deals with the second coming. You would think maybe if communion had any special significance, he was saying, make sure you stay up on getting your communion done so you can be sanctified holy in your body and soul and spirit. No, it says nothing about communion. Communion is completely absent. Timothy and Titus, no instructions regarding communion there. So Romans, the whole gospel and the whole Jewish thing that was going on, no reference to communion. What do you think? Okay, so it's completely absent, and yet for something that's such a major doctrine, such a major issue, and so hard for people to deal with, it has no reference in the New Testament. This is also referenced in the and I don't know whether to say didache or didache, okay, or the teaching of the 12 apostles. And let me put that up on the screen there. Here it's getting ready to appear. There it is. Okay, the didache. Okay, this is the teaching of the 12 apostles. Now, the didache, the teaching of the 12 apostles, did not have sufficient criteria to be included in the canon. Although some did think that maybe that should have been part of the canon. It appears to have been highly regarded in Egypt and Syria. While it is not canonical, it has not been lightly regarded. Scholars have given weight to that. It was written between 50 and 120 AD for instructions to the church, and it gives detailed instructions concerning baptism. The absence of any detail concerning communion indicates that the simple memorial view of communion was standard. Okay, this is supposed to be representative teaching of the time period. So let's read what it says here. It says the Thanksgiving or Eucharist. Now concerning the Thanksgiving, thus give thanks. First concerning the cup, we thank thee, our Father, for the holy vine of David, thy servant. Now, these are footnotes that appear where it has these numbers here. Thy servant that appear in if you go online to check this out. Thy servant, which thou madest known to us through Jesus thy servant, to thee be glory forever. And concerning the broken bread, we thank thee, our Father, for the life and knowledge which thou madest known to us through Jesus thy servant, to thee be glory forever. Even as this broken bread was scattered over the hills and was gathered together and became one, so let thy church be gathered together from the ends of the earth into thy kingdom. For thine is the glory and the power through Jesus Christ forever. But let no one eat or drink of your thanksgiving, but they who have been baptized into the name of the Lord. For concerning this also the Lord hath said, give not that which is holy to the dogs. And you can read this in the Ante-Nicene Fathers by Schaff. This is available. Do I have a footnote for that? I don't. Okay, that you can get that at ccel.org. Stands for Calvin College Electronic Library, ccl.org. And if you look up Philip Schaff or the Ante-Nicene Fathers, you'll be able to see more of those quotes, and he has a lot of information there for that. So again, you see in this teaching, they talk about how it's to be commemorated, but there's nothing about any spiritual efficacy or anything that suggests turning it into the blood of Jesus Christ. So remember, while history does not prove anything, it gives us a sense of what the understanding of the time period was. So we're going to be concluding that this is something that is put off into the future, that when it's going to be addressed. By 100 AD, the notion of communion being Christ's body and blood started to creep in. The fact that Origen, and there's Origen in this time period here, you see him coming up in the near 200 AD. The fact that Origen, Gelasius of Cyzicus, he's in the 5th to 6th century AD, much later. Tertullian, 150 to 240 AD. Theodore of Cyrus, 393 to 458 AD. They all held to a memorial Okay, and you can see their time periods here. Okay, the notion of communion took on more significance than being a memorial was not something that was presupposed. Justin Martyr. Okay, Justin Martyr, who used debated reference to communion, made specific mention of the awareness of a pagan notion of communion. He should be up here on the screen somewhere. Let's see. Where's he at? There he is. Okay. Down here. And you can see his time period. This is like right around 100 AD, early 100s. So he noted that there was a pagan notion that was out there, not in the church. He said, which the wicked devils have imitated in the mysteries of Mithras, commanding the same thing to be done. For that bread and a cup of water that is, are placed with certain incantations in the mystic rites of one who is being initiated. You either know or can learn. Okay, so he's referring to how there was something that was pagan that was going on, not identical, it's sort of similar. One of the earliest explicit mentions of the notion that a priest changes communion into the body and blood of the Lord does not appear until Cyril of Jerusalem. See here on the bottom of the screen here? This is like, what, around 300 AD? Okay, now that's his whole lifespan there, so it was somewhere in the middle here, in the middle of the 4th century. And we'll see more about that on page 136. The teaching of transubstantiation will not be defined until 1215 AD at the Fourth Lateran Council. And you can read in advance on page 151 concerning that. So you're not going to get it defined until much later. Now, one of the things that the Catholic apologists like to do is to suggest that, well, we might have formalized the teaching, but it was there, it was always believed, and that's why we formalized it, except it wasn't always there. It was not popular until, like we show up here, until like 300, around 300 AD. Okay, some comments or questions about that for anybody? Okay, so you should be able to see that there are plenty of reasons to hold firm in our convictions about communion. Not understood as transubstantiation by the early church, not until later was it being introduced. If there was anything, there was a pagan notion, and that pagan notion, that's what's going to be brought into churches. Okay. Okay, let's think about the false teachers. Page 79 and paragraph 194. The emphasis on the loss of the Ephesians' first love is no overstatement when compared to how early it occurred following the ministry of the apostles. By the end of the apostolic age, significant problems were emerging. We're always challenged to recognize the accumulation of heterodoxy or other beliefs and heteropraxy or other practice. So hetero is other. Okay, that's as opposed to homo, which is the same, where we get heterosexuals and homosexuals from, right? So heterodoxy is other beliefs, and heteropraxy, and that is something somebody might have heard of heterodoxy, but heteropraxy is usually not something that's talked about. That's other practice. Often half-hearted attempts are made to get back to what is assumed to be a pure state of religion from an earlier period of the church, with the assumption that the further back you go, the less time there was for such false teachings and practice to build up. This is what's known as the ancient something church. I'd have to look it up. It could be the ancient future church, but the ancient church, and there's this idea, let's get back to the ancient practice. They don't go back far enough. Okay, they go back to maybe 200, 300 AD and say, what were they doing back then? More like 300 AD. And they don't go back far enough. You got to go back to 30 AD. Okay, 30 to 100 AD. This is related to the issue of compromise and reaffirmation that we saw on page 10. There's always this push. Let's go back. Let's go back to the way things were. Look at the compromises. Let's reaffirm what we used to believe, except that it falls short of true reaffirmation. Oh, it is. I have a note here. The ancient future church. Okay. True reaffirmation occurs when we compare ourselves to the Bible, not how churches operated. Now, there are some things that we can see patterns in the New Testament of how churches operated. There's something interesting about forms that are given in the Bible. You never have the forms described sufficiently that you can actually repeat them or copy them. When you look at the ark, the Noah's Ark, you get an idea of how long it was and things like that. You don't have enough information on how to build one. You can get a nice representation that is pretty close to what we think might be a good idea if you go out to Kentucky to Answers in Genesis, okay? But you can't do it. You can't repeat the formula for the various things that the priests were to use, the incense or the or some of the other things. You can't repeat that. You can't do another building of the tabernacle or the temple. Insufficient information. Now you're reading in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and you're seeing all these instructions between knops and flowers and taches. Okay, Nancy and I were and ouches or yeah. And things like that. Yeah, you got a lot of information and how many layers, but you can't actually repeat a building of the tabernacle. Okay, that's the way it is with forms in the Bible. You're never given enough information to do that. So you have some, and you can get some idea of practice, but forms you really can't. And so also we have to say, well, some things of practice have got to be consistent with whatever. So we're going to have a Sunday school, but you don't see Sunday school taught in the Bible. Okay? And some people say, oh, well, therefore we shouldn't have it. We should have the kids go with the parents in all the adult classes and things like that. And I'm thinking, what do you mean you should? Okay. You don't see that said either in the Bible. Can you have a Sunday school? Sure. Okay. It's not inconsistent. Now, how prudent it is to do things one way or another, it's like we had the teenagers class, the youth meeting. While we're small, okay, then we're letting the 12-year-olds come in, okay, to round things out, and which works out kind of nicely. But there's no strict thing that it has to be done this way or that way. Okay, as long as it's consistent, making sure that what we're teaching, the content, that's the critical thing. Okay, and we're doing it prudently. Okay, so the ancient future church movement is a current example of this problem. The movement is used to give an air of authority for postmodern relativism in churches today. It reflects an attitude of not going back far enough because it only considers as far back as the early church, which is, and this is what I said before, is different than going back to the New Testament churches in the Bible. Their assumption is that the churches in the patristic age, or the age of the church fathers from 100 to 600 AD. Now, the patristic age, that's not an age that we use. That's an age that's generally talked about amongst Christian scholars. We break things down according to the seven churches. They'll have they roughly correspond to what's commonly taught in seminaries. That these were the ones that were the earliest firmly established churches and had the most to offer as pure churches. However, consider how Paul, Peter, and Jude described the severity of doctrinal compromise as early as 60 AD. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 1, but there were false prophets also among the people, even as there shall be false teachers among you, who privily shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that bought them, and bring upon themselves swift destruction. Many shall follow their pernicious ways. I love that. Pernicious ways, by reason of whom the way of truth shall be evil spoken of. And through covetous shall they with feigned words make merchandise of you, whose judgment now of a long time, whose judgment now in his time of a long time lingereth not, and their damnation slumbereth not. Okay, for Peter to write about this was something that was very present. This was not some idle thing like, oh yeah, someday this might come around or not. No, he was talking about as a present problem at that time. 2 Peter 3, verse 15, an account that the long suffering of our Lord is salvation, even as our beloved brother Paul also, according to the wisdom given unto him, hath written unto you, as also in all his epistles, speaking in them of these things, in which are some things hard to be understood, which they that are unlearned and unstable wrest, as they do also the other scriptures, unto their own destruction. And it goes back before Paul. Jesus had the same problem with people. They had things that were hard to understand, and they wrestled with it. Ye therefore, beloved, seeing you know these things before, beware lest you also, being led away with the air of the wicked, fall away or fall from your own steadfastness. Again, present day problem back then. Okay, so it's not that the churches 100, 600 AD were the earliest, firmest ones. No, they had infirmity, even before that time period, even before the patristic age. Philippians 3:17, and that would be called the apostolic age, by the way. That when you go by seminary standards, okay, you had before the patristic age, before the church fathers, you had the apostles. Okay, so during the apostolic age, before you got to the patristic age, they were having problems. Philippians 3:17, brethren, be followers together of me, and mark them which walk so as you have us for an example. For many walk, currently back in that day, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who mind to earthly things. Okay, and I will leave the rest of these for you to read on your own. It'll just keep confirming it. Ancient future church, no. The future church that is supposed to be a copy of the ancient church, bad. It's a bad movement in my thinking. They don't go back far enough. They go back to a time when you had lots of error already well entrenched, especially if you go from, if they're saying 100 to 600 AD, yeah, 300 to 600 AD was a horrific period for stuff getting into the church. Okay, Miss Nancy.
Yeah, since this is a church history class and Calvinism is definitely going to be coming up.
Yeah.
The passage that you read, 2 Peter 2,
Yeah.
1-3, this is one of my go-to passages when I'm speaking to a Calvinist who insists that God sent Christ to die only for the pre-selected people that he knew ahead of time were going to be saved. Because it specifically says, because if you try to show them verses that say Christ died for the whole world, not for our sins only, they'll say, yeah, but the world of born again people, they, even though it differentiates two groups, this passage says there were false prophets among all the people. Now, these are not believers in God. They are false prophets. Even as there shall be false teachers among you, who privily shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that bought them.
Yeah.
And bring upon themselves swift destruction. So it appears to me from this passage that Christ died for everyone, even false teachers and God deniers and the whole lot of everybody else. And I have not had an answer from any of them yet, and I've shown them this passage.
Yeah. Somebody else. Yeah. Okay. So something you should be getting out of this as we go through this, you're really, all I'm doing is repeating myself in numerous ways so that we can say that that there is plenty of justification for the stand that we take. When you have somebody coming up and saying, "Oh, well, we have this from ancient times," and this is what we've always done, say, no, not really. Okay, when you start to go back, you start to look at these details after details. How much detail do you need before you can say, no, baptism is symbolic, communion is symbolic? And it's a remembrance. And there's no justification otherwise for that. This is something that distinctly came up at a later time. Okay. Anything else? Well, okay. I will say that the next section that we're going to look at on eschatology and various issues that were there, there's going to be some stuff that we'll be repeating from before about the relationship between Judaism and the church. But we're going to get in a few extra things that will be very important to us. So, I'm very much looking forward to that. I'm hoping that. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how far we get into it, because I'll be dealing specifically with tongues, the issue of speaking in tongues, and I'll be giving you the best argument that I can think of. And I've seen others use it also. They must have been reading my sermons or something. I don't know. But I've been very encouraged to see that this has occurred to others also. The argument why not speaking in tongues, that's going to be coming up. That's going to come up on around page 85.